Not every unexplained thing in the history of spaceflight involves a glowing object or a strange light on the horizon. Some of it is quieter than that. A smell that should not exist in a vacuum. A glow at the edge of the moon that took 40 years and a dedicated spacecraft to partially explain, and still does not fully match what the astronauts actually saw. A sense of not being alone, reported independently by people separated by decades, and by agencies that never shared notes. These are not campfire stories. They are sitting in NASA's own research archives, in peer-reviewed journals, and in the personal accounts of some of the most credible, technically trained people who have ever left this planet. Several of them are still actively studied today, not because anyone doubts they happened, but because nobody has fully worked out why. These are 10 more things astronauts saw, smelled, and felt in space that NASA still has not fully explained. Number 10. The smell that should not exist in a vacuum. Since the earliest spacewalks of the shuttle era, astronauts returning through the airlock after working outside the spacecraft have consistently described a distinct, unmistakable smell clinging to their suits, their gloves, and their equipment. Almost without exception, they describe it the same way: hot metal, seared steak, gunpowder after a rifle has been fired. A faint, sweet, burnt smell that lingers for a short time after they remove their helmets. This should not be possible in any simple sense. Smell requires airborne molecules reaching receptors in the nose, and the vacuum of space contains no air to carry a scent from one place to another. Astronauts are not smelling space itself while they are outside in their suits. What they are smelling is something that happens the moment vacuum-exposed material re-enters the pressurized environment of the airlock. And that is where the explanation becomes murkier than it first appears. NASA scientists and chemists, including researchers working with the agency's Johnson Space Center, have proposed that the smell results from a combination of atomic oxygen reacting with the outer layer of suits and equipment, along with the sudden off-gassing of trace compounds that had been essentially frozen in place by vacuum exposure and are released all at once when air returns. This explanation is reasonable and partially supported by chemical analysis. What it has never fully done is reproduce the exact, consistent character of the smell reported by astronauts, independently across decades, missions, and different spacecraft. The description has been so consistent that NASA has, on more than one occasion, worked with outside chemists and fragrance companies to try to recreate it artificially for astronaut training purposes, giving new crew members a preview of a sensation official science still cannot fully explain the precise mechanism behind. The smell is real. Multiple senses, multiple witnesses, multiple decades. The chemistry that produces it, in the specific and repeatable way astronauts describe, has never been completely nailed down. Number 9. The glow at the edge of the moon that took 40 years to partly explain. During the final Apollo missions in the early 1970s, astronauts including Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt on Apollo 17 reported observing a faint, diffuse glow along the lunar horizon just before sunrise. A soft band of light rising above the terrain in a way that did not match any known atmospheric effect, since the moon has essentially no atmosphere to produce the kind of scattering that creates similar glows on Earth. This was not the first time the phenomenon had been noticed. Years earlier, unmanned surveyor landers had photographed a similar faint glow near the lunar horizon at twilight, and geologist Eugene Shoemaker had proposed as early as the 1960s that the effect might be caused by fine lunar dust particles becoming electrically charged by solar radiation and lifting slightly off the surface, scattering sunlight in a way that could account for the glow. For decades, this remained an educated guess rather than a confirmed explanation, since no instrument had been sent specifically to measure it. In 2013, NASA launched the Lunar Atmosphere and Dust Environment Explorer, known as LADY, specifically in part to investigate this exact phenomenon, using instruments capable of detecting charged dust particles above the lunar surface. LADY did detect a persistent cloud of dust particles surrounding the moon, confirming that Shoemaker's basic mechanism was real, and that electrostatically lofted dust does exist in the lunar environment. What LADY's data did not fully do was reproduce a brightness level consistent with the dramatic glow described by the Apollo astronauts and photographed by the earlier Surveyor landers, leaving the precise scale and visibility of the phenomenon only partially reconciled with what human eyes on the lunar surface actually reported seeing. The dust is confirmed. The mechanism is broadly correct. The exact intensity of what Cernan, Schmidt, and the astronauts before them personally witnessed with their own eyes remains, even with a dedicated spacecraft mission built specifically to solve it, not completely matched by the data that mission brought home. Number 8. The light flashes that Apollo astronauts saw with their eyes closed. Throughout the Apollo missions, astronauts, including several who walked on the lunar surface, reported seeing brief flashes of light, streaks and points of color, white, blue, and occasionally described as golden, appearing in their vision even with their eyes fully closed in the darkness of the spacecraft during rest periods. The flashes occurred repeatedly, sometimes several times an hour, and were reported independently by multiple crew members across different missions. NASA scientists identified the general cause relatively quickly. The flashes are triggered by high-energy cosmic ray particles, traveling through space at enormous speed, passing directly through the astronaut's eye and interacting with either the retina or the visual pathways leading to the brain. On Earth, our atmosphere and magnetic field absorb the overwhelming majority of these particles before they reach us. In deep space, and in orbit above much of Earth's protective shielding, astronauts are exposed to a steady stream of them, and their brains register each significant hit as a brief flash of light, even with the eyes closed and no external light source present at all. This general mechanism has been confirmed and studied further on later missions, including formal experiments conducted by astronaut Christer Fuglesang aboard the International Space Station in 2006, using specialized detection equipment to correlate the timing of reported flashes with the timing of actual particle strikes recorded by onboard instruments. The correlation confirmed the basic physical cause beyond reasonable doubt. What remains genuinely unresolved, even in current research, is the precise point in the visual system where the interaction actually produces the sensation of light. Whether the particle is directly striking light-sensitive cells in the retina, interacting with the optic nerve, or in some cases, triggering activity directly in the visual processing regions of the brain itself. Since different studies have found evidence consistent with more than one of these mechanisms, depending on the specific particle and its trajectory. Astronauts have learned to live with the flashes, describing them almost as background noise on long missions. The exact biological pathway producing each individual flash is still, more than 50 years after Apollo, an active subject of research rather than a fully closed question. Number 7. The layer of light that surrounds the entire planet. Nearly every astronaut who has orbited Earth has described the same striking visual experience during orbital sunrise and sunset. A thin, glowing band of light hugging the curve of the planet, shifting through greens, golds, and reds, visible with a clarity and vividness that no photograph fully captures, according to the astronauts who have tried repeatedly to photograph it. This band is known as airglow, and it has become one of the most photographed and most personally described phenomena in the entire history of human spaceflight. The basic cause of airglow has been understood in general terms since the early 20th century. Sunlight breaks apart oxygen molecules in Earth's upper atmosphere during the day, and as those separated oxygen atoms slowly recombine after sunset, they release a small amount of energy as light, producing a faint but genuine glow that circles the entire planet at all times, far too dim to see easily from the ground through the thickness of the lower atmosphere, but strikingly visible from orbit, where astronauts are looking through a much thinner slice of atmosphere at a shallow angle. What continues to generate active scientific interest, and what has never been fully mapped or explained in complete detail, is the layer's remarkable variability, its brightness, color balance, and structure shifting noticeably from night to night and region to region, in ways that do not always correlate cleanly with the solar activity and atmospheric chemistry models researchers use to predict it. Astronauts, including several aboard the International Space Station, have contributed extensive personal photography, specifically because ground-based instruments alone have not been sufficient to fully characterize the layer's behavior. And NASA continues to treat astronaut-captured airglow imagery as scientifically valuable data rather than simply a beautiful view. The glow itself is completely real and has never been in dispute. Its exact night-to-night behavior, observed and documented by the very people orbiting inside it, remains only partially predictable, even now. Number 6. The false star that follows the sun, and nobody has fully mapped. Astronauts observing space from orbit, away from the scattering effect of Earth's atmosphere, have long reported an unusually vivid version of a phenomenon that ground-based observers can only faintly detect under perfect dark sky conditions. A soft, cone-shaped glow extending outward from the direction of the sun, along with a separate, extremely faint patch of light directly opposite the sun in the night sky. These are known respectively as the zodiacal light and the Gegenschein. both produced by sunlight scattering off countless microscopic dust particles distributed throughout the plane of our solar system. For most of the 20th century, the general cause was well understood, even if the fine detail was not. Sunlight reflecting off interplanetary dust left over from the formation of the solar system, along with material continuously shed by comets and asteroids as they pass through the inner solar system. Astronauts photographing it from orbit, unfiltered by atmospheric distortion, have captured versions of the glow considerably more vivid and structured than anything visible from the ground, occasionally showing subtle banding and asymmetries that ground-based astronomy struggled to confirm. The precise origin of this dust cloud remained a genuinely open question for decades. In 2021, a research team analyzing years of accumulated dust impact data collected incidentally by NASA's Juno spacecraft during its long cruise to Jupiter, led by physicist John Leif Jorgensen at the Technical University of Denmark, proposed that a significant portion of the material producing the zodiacal light may actually originate from dust ejected by Mars, rather than primarily from comets as most earlier models assumed. A conclusion that surprised much of the planetary science community and has not yet been universally accepted. The glow itself has been seen, described, and photographed by astronauts for as long as humans have traveled to orbit. Where all of its material actually comes from, and in what proportion, was still being actively revised by new spacecraft data as recently as the past few years, and remains, in the technical literature, an unsettled question. Number 5. The condition where space slowly changes how astronauts see. Beginning with observations first formally reported in 2005 and confirmed as a recurring pattern in the years following, NASA flight surgeons identified that a significant proportion of astronauts returning from long-duration missions aboard the International Space Station were experiencing measurable changes to their eyes and vision, including swelling of the optic nerve, flattening of the back of the eyeball, and folds in the tissue at the back of the eye, changes that, in some cases, persisted for months, or, in a smaller number of cases, appeared not to fully reverse even years after return to Earth. NASA's Human Research Program eventually classified this condition formally as spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, commonly abbreviated as SANS, and it is now recognized as one of the most significant unresolved medical concerns for long-duration spaceflight, actively studied specifically because its underlying cause has never been fully determined, despite well over a decade of dedicated research involving detailed pre-flight and post-flight eye imaging on nearly every long-duration astronaut since the pattern was first identified. The leading hypothesis involves the headward shift of bodily fluids that occurs in microgravity. Since without Earth's gravity pulling fluid toward the lower body the way it does constantly on the ground, blood and other fluids redistribute toward the head, and may increase pressure around the optic nerve and eye in ways the body never experiences on Earth. This explanation is broadly accepted as part of the picture, but researchers, including those at NASA's Johnson Space Center, have repeatedly noted in published findings that fluid shift alone does not fully account for why some astronauts develop severe changes, while others on similarly long missions develop almost none, despite comparable physical conditioning and mission profiles. This remains one of NASA's most actively funded areas of astronaut health research, specifically because the agency needs to solve it before committing to multi-year missions to Mars, where returning early for treatment would not be an option. Astronauts have seen their own vision change, measurably and sometimes significantly, in a pattern doctors can document in extraordinary detail and still cannot fully predict or explain for any individual crew member before they fly. Number 4. The loneliest human being who has ever lived, and what he described about the far side of the moon. During the Apollo 11 mission in July of 1969, while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended to the lunar surface, astronaut Michael Collins remains alone aboard the command module Columbia, orbiting the moon. For a portion of every orbit, as the spacecraft passed behind the far side of the moon, Collins lost all radio contact with both his crewmates below and with mission control on Earth, placing him, for those specific minutes, more completely isolated from every other human being than anyone in the entire history of the species up to that point. Collins later wrote about this experience extensively, describing not fear, but an unusually profound and specific form of solitude, a sense of being utterly alone in a way that had no precedent and, at the time, no comparison anywhere in human history. He described it as a feeling distinct from ordinary loneliness, tied specifically to the physical fact of the moon itself, blocking every possible channel of contact with every other human being alive. A condition that had literally never existed for any person before that mission. NASA's mission records confirm the technical reality of the communication blackout precisely. And Collins's own writings, including his memoir, Carrying the Fire, describe the psychological texture of the experience in careful, specific detail. What has never been fully studied or explained, because the exact circumstance has been experienced by so few people in history, is the specific psychological character of that particular, singular form of isolation, distinct from isolation experienced in any Earth-bound extreme environment. And whether the handful of other astronauts who have since experienced similar communication blackouts during lunar missions felt something comparable or something entirely their own. Collins remained matter-of-fact about the experience for the rest of his life, famously noting that he was not lonely in any way that worried him. The precise psychological territory he was the first human being to occupy, alone, on the far side of another world, has never been the subject of the kind of rigorous study applied to nearly every other aspect of the Apollo missions, simply because so few people have ever been in a position to have it studied. Number 3. The presence James Irwin felt standing on the moon. In July of 1971, astronaut James Irwin became the 8th human being to walk on the lunar surface during the Apollo 15 mission. Irwin was, by every account from his colleagues, a disciplined engineer and test pilot, not a man given to mysticism before his mission. What happened to him during his time on the lunar surface changed the entire direction of the rest of his life. Irwin later described experiencing an overwhelming and specific sense of a divine presence while working on the moon, a feeling he described as being profoundly and unmistakably close to God in a way he had never approached in any previous experience on Earth, despite having been raised with conventional religious background that had not previously produced anything resembling this intensity of feeling. He described it not as a vague sense of awe at the view, which nearly every astronaut reports in some form, but as something considerably more specific, personal, and overwhelming. Unlike Edgar Mitchell's later, more philosophically framed experience of cosmic interconnectedness during the return flight of Apollo 14, Irwin's account was explicitly religious in character and occurred specifically while he was physically present and working on the lunar surface itself, not during the quiet return journey home. The distinction mattered enough to Irwin that he left NASA specifically to found the High Flight Foundation, a religious organization built directly around sharing what he described as his lunar experience. And he spent the remainder of his life speaking publicly about it until his death in 1991. NASA has never offered, and has had no operational reason to offer, any official explanation for Irwin's experience, since it caused no mission complication and was, like Mitchell's, an entirely internal and subjective event. Psychologists studying extreme environments have proposed general frameworks involving stress, isolation, and the profound unfamiliarity of the lunar environment as possible contributing factors to intense subjective experiences of this kind. None of these general frameworks were ever accepted by Irwin himself as adequate to what he specifically described feeling, and he remained certain for the remaining 20 years of his life that something real had happened to him on that specific patch of gray lunar dust. Number 2. The sounds heard aboard the International Space Station that have never been individually logged and solved. Since the International Space Station became continuously occupied in the year 2000, astronauts from many countries across more than 2 decades of rotating crews have periodically reported hearing unexplained sounds through the station's hull, taps, creaks, and occasionally more structured knocking patterns, distinct enough from routine equipment noise that crew members have flagged them in communications with mission control on separate, unrelated occasions spread across different years and different modules of the station. This is a broader and more diffuse phenomenon than any single dramatic incident, precisely because the International Space Station is an enormous, continuously operating structure built from components manufactured by multiple space agencies, subjected to constant and dramatic temperature swings as it passes in and out of direct sunlight, roughly every 90 minutes, a cycle that causes its metal structure to expand and contract audibly on a near-continuous basis. NASA's general position, applied broadly across individual incidents rather than investigated one by one in most cases, is that the overwhelming majority of these sounds result from this thermal cycling, along with the routine operation of pumps, fans, and mechanical systems throughout the station. This explanation accounts for the general background hum and creak of a working spacecraft extremely well. It has been applied less consistently to specific incidents where crew members describe sounds with a rhythmic or directional quality distinct from the more random creaking associated with thermal expansion. Incidents that, because they cause no operational problem, were generally logged and not pursued with dedicated follow-up investigation. Across more than 2 decades of continuous human occupation, representing thousands of individual crew members' cumulative experience aboard the same structure, no comprehensive public catalog exists correlating every reported unusual sound with a specific confirmed mechanical cause. The station remains, after 25 years in orbit, one of the most thoroughly engineered and monitored structures ever built by humanity, and it still occasionally makes sounds that the humans living inside it did not expect and were not given a specific, individually confirmed answer for. Number 1. The presence that finds people who are utterly alone and follows them into orbit. In extreme environments on Earth, mountaineers stranded near death on high peaks, polar explorers crossing vast stretches of ice alone, and shipwreck survivors adrift for extended periods have independently and repeatedly reported an extraordinarily consistent phenomenon, an unmistakable and vivid sense that another person, an unseen companion, was present with them during their most extreme moments of isolation and physical crisis, offering a feeling of guidance or comfort, despite there being no other human being anywhere near them. Author John Geiger formally documented and named this pattern the third man factor in a book of the same name published in 2009, compiling accounts from across more than a century of extreme survival situations that had never previously been studied together as a single, coherent phenomenon. What makes this relevant to spaceflight is that astronauts, operating in one of the most extreme and physically isolating environments a human being can enter, have described remarkably similar sensations during specific high-stress or deeply isolating moments in their missions, particularly during solo extravehicular activity far from any other crew member, or during long stretches of a mission spent in unusual physical or psychological strain. These accounts have surfaced in interviews and personal reflections rather than in formal mission reports, since the experience causes no operational issue, and astronauts, like the survivalists studied before them, often describe a reluctance to discuss it publicly for fear of sounding irrational. Neuroscientists and psychologists studying the broader third man factor phenomenon have proposed explanations involving extreme sensory deprivation, physical exhaustion, and the brain's tendency to generate a sense of social presence as a coping mechanism during overwhelming isolation. Mechanisms that plausibly extend to the unique isolation of spaceflight as well as to mountaineering and polar exploration. These explanations describe a believable general pathway. They have never fully explained why the specific character of the experience, a sensed companion rather than a vague feeling of comfort, appears with such striking consistency across wildly different individuals, environments, and eras, all independently converging on the same specific description of the same specific thing. Whatever it is, it appears to find people specifically when they are most alone, whether they are lost on a mountain, adrift on an ocean, or floating hundreds of miles above the Earth with nothing but a thin suit between them and the vacuum. Nobody has yet fully explained why. 10 more accounts. A smell with no air to carry it, reproduced deliberately by NASA for training, because nobody has fully explained where it comes from. A glow on the moon so consistent across missions that it took a dedicated spacecraft 40 years later to only partially confirm what astronauts had already described with their own eyes. A layer of light circling the entire planet, photographed obsessively by the people living inside it, because ground instruments alone were never enough to understand it. Vision itself, changing in ways doctors can measure precisely and still cannot predict. The specific, singular loneliness of one man behind the moon. The presence another man felt standing on it. A space station that has been quietly making unexplained sounds for a quarter century. And a companion that seems to find people, again and again, in the exact moment they are most alone, whether on a mountain, an ocean, or in orbit. None of this requires anything beyond what is already written down in NASA's own research archive, in peer-reviewed medical journals, and in the astronauts' own words. The witnesses were chosen, trained, and repeatedly evaluated specifically for their reliability. What they experienced was real enough to study, real enough to fund, and, in several cases, real enough to change the rest of their lives. What produced it, in each individual instance, has not always followed them home with an answer attached. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.